And welcome back, nerds. Today we're going to be looking at creating an inventory system. We'll be taking this all the way from the beginning, including a scene setup. Then we'll add the space for the inventory itself, with an open and close feature, the ability to collect items, a mechanic to stack items. We'll add the option to drop items. And finally, we'll allow the user to add more inventory slots. So, without further ado, let's get to it. Our first goal here is to set up a scene that allows us to move around and bump into items so we can then pick them up and set them in our inventory. We're going to start out by adding a background and then a player character. And we'll just set the size so we can actually see it. And next I'm going to want to add a few items to pick up. I'm going to go with 5 different weapon items. And we can go ahead and drag those out onto our map. And just like our player character, they're going to be too small for what we want. So we're going to just open up the object itself and edit the size by going to Edit in Piskel, clicking on Resize, and I'm just going to set those to 64 by 64. And we'll do this for every one of our new weapons. And additionally here, we have 2 different animations on each of our items. And to save space, we can just go ahead and delete all the ones that have a shadow since we won't be using those. And I'll go ahead and drag all 5 of those onto my scene. But I also want to grab at least 1 additional item. That way we can show that they do not stack, since these will be our normal items. And then in order to make this more dynamic, we're going to add a group. And this will make it so we can talk about the whole group of items, rather than just one at a time. And we simply pull all those into the group. Next, we'll go ahead and make our character controllable. And I'll just use the top down for that. And in our events, we'll go ahead and set it so we get some basic animations for our character. And we'll just on any key pressed face the direction of our last key. If anything to do with the character movement or animations was a bit confusing for you, I do have a full video on directional movement, and if you need a deeper analysis, you can go ahead and check that out in the description below. Last thing, I'll just add an outline effect, so our character pops out a bit more from the background. Alright, now that we have a moving character and our items, it's time to add an inventory space to put them. So we can use a built-in inventory object. And since we did resize our items, the inventories will also be too small. And there's also a lot of white space on these inventories, so I'm going to choose 128 by 128, and that's going to make it just bigger than our items here. And we can see that by changing the Z order and just setting one on top of an item. Obviously that's not how we want to keep the inventory slot, so I'm going to remove that. And I'm going to take a moment here to just rename some of my objects so they make a bit more sense. And while I'm cleaning up, I'll make a new folder and I'll put all of my weapon items I was using earlier into that folder. And now I just have 4 scene objects, which is a lot more manageable. So now that we have our inventory slot, we need something to represent the bag, and we'll just make a new tiled sprite. And I want something really tall, but kinda skinny. So I'm going to keep the 16 pixel width. And change the height to 128. And I won't do anything too fancy here. We'll just fill in the background with a gray, and then give some sort of trim to the top. And then since this is a tiled sprite, Just like with the grass, we can drag it out on our scene. And as long as it is smaller than 128 pixels high, it will not redraw the top border. And we can go as wide as we want, which will be from the left to the right side of our scene. And we're going to take note that we like it at the y-axis of 599. And then we're also going to move it down. And I want it just below the scene, that way I don't have to go hunting for it. So 799, we'll put it outside of the scene. And that'll all be for later when we move the inventory in and out of our view. Next, we're going to line up the inventory slots. And I'm just going to start out with 5 inventory slots here. And I want them to all be the same y-axis and the same distance apart. And I ended up doing 108 pixels between each one on the x-axis. So we can hop in our event sheet here, and we will build in a little mechanic to toggle between showing and hiding the inventory when we press the I key. And we're going to want this to only trigger one time. And we're going to have 3 conditions. And in order for this to work, we'll also need a variable, and we'll just put this as an object variable on our tiled sprite, since that's what we're going to be moving. And it'll be a boolean, and it'll tell us whether or not our inventory is currently hidden or currently showing. And then in our events, one of those conditions will be if it is currently showing, the other will be if it is currently hidden, and the third one will be all the time. So if our hidden is true, that means we cannot see it, and we're going to want to set the new Y position to 599, which was at the bottom of our screen. And if our hidden is false, that means we do see it, so we're going to want to set the Y position to 799, which was below our screen. And the last sub-event is just going to be to toggle between that hidden. So now every time you press I, it'll grab one of those 2 conditions on whether to move it up or down, and then toggle to be ready to use the next one next time. And since that just moves our inventory, we're going to need a way to make our slots stay with our inventory, and we'll use the sticker behavior. And this will literally just connect the 2 together as long as we have the stick behavior on. So at the beginning of our scene, we can set an event to grab every inventory slot object and stick it to our inventory. And I like to move beginning of the scene events to the top since they happen in the beginning. And if we press I, we can see that our inventory comes up and now has all the inventory slots with it. Great, now all we need to do is find a way to make our items end up in our inventory. We're going to start off adding a few variables, and we're going to want each inventory slot to know what they're holding. So we're going to give them an item held, that'll be a string. And we're also going to want them to know whether or not they're holding an item or not. So we'll give them a boolean variable and call this full. Additionally, I am going to give the items a boolean to know whether or not they are collected or have been put in the inventory. That way both the inventory slot and the item know. We're going to need to add this variable to every item. And I suggest just copying the first one and pasting it into each item. Now in our event sheets, we're going to do a for each object. And we're going to put items in there. This is just to make sure that if we hit 2 of our objects at the same time, it will run it for every object we bump into. And we're going to grab an on collision with an item. And that'll be any one of our weapons so far. And when we collide, we're going to want to check the boolean variable collected and make sure it's false, because we don't want our character to be interacting with already collected items. This way, if we have the inventory move over our character or anything, nothing will happen if we retouch the collected items. Then we're going to find the first inventory slot that is not full. And we'll do that just by picking the furthest to the left inventory that has the boolean full as false. Now we can take that item and simply change the position. And since we're already tracking an inventory slot from our conditions, we can use the inventory slot X and Y axis as our position to move our item. And we're going to want to stick our item into the inventory. So we're going to have to go to all our items. And we're going to need to add the sticker behavior as well. And once we have all our items set up with the sticker behavior, back in our action, we will set our item to stick to the inventory slot that we just stuck it in. And this will make it so when we hide or show our inventory, the item stays with it. Then we'll bump the item's Z order to 1 above the inventory slot, and this just makes sure it shows on top of the inventory slot. Then in the inventory slots variable, we'll add to the item held variable the item's object name. We'll also set the boolean full to true, that way that inventory slot's not used again. And we'll set the item to collected. And we'll pull up a preview with the debugger. And there's going to be a few instances we want to pay attention to here. If we look at a random item, we can see the collected is false on our items. And our inventory slots, we have a string which has a 0 in it and a boolean for the full of false. And then we can go find the axe that we just picked up. And that's actually the battle axe, and one of them is still false and one of them is true. So it worked in our item. And then if we go to our inventory slot, we can see our first one, or the furthest left one, is now full and holds that battle axe string. So everything is working there, and looking at the inventory, everything's working. The positioning is just off a little bit, and that's just due to our item objects and our inventory slots being different sizes. So we'll just need to set a new point inside of our inventory slot, and right around 3232 is going to set those items up to fit in the center of our inventory slots. So that fixes the item, but moving the origin of our inventory slot moves all of our inventory slots, so we're just going to have to recorrect those back to the center of our inventory. And pulling that up again, we can see everything is working smoothly. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, I want to go ahead and take a moment to give a massive shout out to my first channel member, Xtel. Thank you so much, it means the world. For anyone else still interested in joining, there'll be a link on the bottom. Help support me in my mission to support your game development journey. Once again, thank you, Xtel. And with that part working smoothly, we are ready to add stackable items. First thing we're going to need to do is add an item that actually stacks. So we're going to go back into the asset store and grab 2 different types of potions. And just like with the weapons, we're going to create a new folder to hide our potions in. And furthermore, we are going to create a new group. And this one will be called Items Stackable. And we'll edit that and add both the potions in there. And hide our object groups again. And we'll go ahead and give the potions the same variables that we gave to our weapons, which is the collected boolean. Additionally, our inventory slot's going to need a few more variables. And one's going to be for an item count, and the other one's going to be to check whether or not it's holding stackable items. So that'll be a boolean and a number variable. And we'll go ahead and drag some of those out to our screen. And of course, the width and height is too small again, so we're going to resize those to 64. And delete the shadow animation. And I'll pull out 2 red ones and 3 blue ones just so we have enough to test with. And we should ignore those completely right now since we don't work with item stackable yet, but it should not break anything to do with our items. Now inside of our event sheet, we're going to want to build essentially the same event, but for item stackable. So we'll do a for each item stackable, and player is on collision with item stackable, and we'll verify that they are not collected with the boolean. From here, we're going to break it down into two separate conditions. One being whether or not the item we bumped into has the same name as any inventory slot's item held. And this will let us know if we already found this item before. And just like with the other event, we're going to find the furthest left or first inventory slot that this happens for. And since this means we already hold one of these in our inventory system, we don't need to move the position, we just need to add to the count. So we'll go ahead and delete that item stackable, and we'll change the inventory slots item count and add 1 to it. Next, we'll add a global variable called found, and it'll be a boolean. And each time we start this event, we will set that to false. And then if the conditions we just made are true, we'll set it to true. Then next in our new condition, we'll check if that found variable is false, and this will stop people from going into both events. Which means this event will only work if we do not already have that item in our inventory. And this will act again a lot like our previous items, where we will change the position to the inventory slot. And then we'll stick the item stackable to our inventory slot, which again, we'll have to add the behaviors. We'll set the Z order to +1 of the inventory slot. And we'll set the item held variable and full variable, just as we did before. As well as setting that item stackable collected to true. And we're going to need a text object to show the item count. That way we know how many of each stackable item we have. And I'm going to throw the effect outline on there just to make it more visible. So now in our condition where we find the item for the first time, we'll create the object for the text variable. And we'll set it to our inventory X and Y. And then we'll also go into that object and set the text. And that value is going to be equal to our inventory slot's item count variable. And we'll go ahead and add this sticker behavior to that as well. And we'll give a quick test to see what's happening. And we are now collecting the potions and creating the item count text. But the item count is not adding. And that's because we did not add anything to our item count on our first find. So this should fix that. And now when we find the same potion multiple times, we are having an error with adding multiple counts. And it's actually tracking the number. We just did not update the text. So we'll go ahead and hit change text to item count, and that should fix the counting of multiple. And now we have a weird behavior where both numbers are changing to the last one updated, and that's just because we're not picking a specific text object to change. So we're going to add an extra condition. And we're just going to pick the nearest item count to the inventory slot that we've been working with. That way it only changes the one. And we'll move the change text into that action. And this should fix all of our item stackable events. And we'll also grab a few normal items just to verify nothing broke. Now that we're able to fill our inventory, we need a way to discard items we do not want. So we'll add our drop loot event. And first we need a way to decide we want to drop loot. And I'm going to use a right mouse click. And I'm just going to drag this event up a bit higher so it's not at the very bottom of the page. The actual location does not matter, just to make it easier to see. And we're going to go on right click released. And the cursor is over an inventory slot. And then for our sub events, we're going to want to check if that inventory slot is on a collision with items, or if that inventory slot is in a collision with items stackable. And this lets us know what we're working with. And we'll go ahead and work the items one first, since it is a bit easier. So if we right click on an items, we're going to want to grab the nearest one to the inventory slot we clicked on. Then we're going to take that items and we are going to change the position. And I'm just going to set it to my player's position plus about 20 pixels on the x-axis. That way it's not instantly touching us again. And I'm going to use bounding box right, and this is just grabbing the right side of my player box and adding the 20 pixels there. And then the Y I will just leave as the player's Y position. And we need to undo all the variables that we set when we put the item in there. So we will set the inventory slot full to false. We can set the inventory's item held to null. And we can set the items itself to no longer be collected. Now if we take a look, we can pick up items and right click them and drop them. And we can re-pick them up by walking on them again. Next up, we will do our item stackables. And again, we'll want to pick the closest item stackable to the inventory slot we clicked. And whenever we click on an item stackable, we're going to want to have two different sets of conditions. One, if it is the last item, or if there's only an item count of 1. And the other, if there's an item count of more than 1. So we'll set those both up. And we'll go ahead and work with the greater than 1 first. And we'll subtract 1 from the item count. And then we're still going to need that item stackable to be in our inventory, so we'll have to create a new object to throw onto the ground. So we'll create an item stackable by its object's name. And since we're already working with our item stackable, we can just grab the object name out of that. And we're going to set it up to drop off to the side of the player again. And then we need to change the item count text to show the updated item count. So let's hop in and make sure everything's working as expected. And we can drop our potions and repick them up until we get down to just the last one left. And of course that's because we have nothing for the variable item count equaling 1. So we'll work that one next. And we can take that item count and set it to 0. And we'll go ahead and delete the text object since we'll no longer have anything in that inventory slot. And just like with the items, we can now just move that last item's stackable off to the right of our player and undo all of the variables. So we have the inventory slots full set to false, item held set back to null, and item stackable collected can be set to false now. And we'll verify we can drop the last item stackable. And we can with no issue, and then we can repick them up. And we can drop both types of potions, but it destroys both item texts. So we're going to need to break it down one step further and make sure we are selecting the correct item count text. And we'll just do that by grabbing the nearest one to the inventory slot that we're working with. and dragging that delete item count down to that condition. And now we should have a fully working inventory with the ability to pick up and drop items. And all that's left is our final mechanic. Alright, let's finish this up with the ability to add new inventory slots. We're going to add a button as our condition to add new slots. And we'll just give it a new text value. Then inside of our events, we'll create a new condition for clicking the button. And we'll add an additional condition, and this will be to check how many inventory slots we currently have, and we'll just use the compare to numbers. And we'll look at a count of our inventory slots, and we'll just check to see if it's less than 12. When that's done, we'll create a new object. And we're just going to create that object at the furthest to the right inventory slot plus 108 pixels, because that's what we were using to separate them earlier. And we'll pick the furthest one to the right by selecting the nearest and plugging 1300 into our X position, which is kind of the opposite of what we were doing when we were grabbing 0 to grab the furthest to the left. So now we can add inventory slots, but they do not stick to our inventory. And also 12 is one too many, so I'm going to drop this down to 11 so one doesn't go off the edge of the screen. And then on the creation of a new inventory slot, we're just going to add the stick effect. That way it stays on the inventory. And a quick preview, we can add inventory slots even when the inventory is down and they go on the right spot and stay there. And there we have it. Your inventory system is set up and ready to be transferred to any of your other games. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, I'll catch you in the next one. Until then, peace.